Hey everyone, today we're looking at government intervention in exchange rates. So let's get into it. We're going to look at what a fixed exchange rate is. So that is when a central bank of a country fixes their exchange rate to the value of another currency. That's the most common way of doing it. And what that means is that the exchange rate is not allowed to change due to forces of demand and supply. So they keep it at a set level. So it might always be worth, for instance, 75 US cents, right? They always fix it to that amount. Why would they do that? It gives people some certainty. So you always know what the exchange rate is going to be. It removes what we call exchange rate risk, which is when you don't know if the exchange rate is going to appreciate or depreciate. And what that means is you don't know how feasible your business is going to be. You don't know how profitable it is going to be. So that certainty can actually help firms be more confident and therefore do more investment and do more trade, set up those trade relationships. That trade relationships are generally longer term. So if you say, we're going to buy this good from India, you're going to think about doing that for a long time. If you know that their exchange rate is not going to change, you might be more willing to do that. This is what I just said. The risk of exchange rate fluctuation can make firms hesitant to set up trade relationships or to invest in other countries. They might not know what kind of return they're going to get. So a fixed exchange rate can avoid that. How do they fix it? Those market forces are still going to happen. So what the government has to do, the government or the central bank, they've got to counteract those forces. They've got to do sort of the opposite to keep it at that level they want it at. First way they do this is they buy and sell foreign currency reserves. So central banks, every central bank around the world, they will hold reserves of foreign currencies. The Reserve Bank of Australia, we've got a bunch of US dollars, we've got lots of euros, pounds, yen, and so forth. Lots of them. And at any time, a central bank can use those to influence the value of their own currency. So we're going to show how that would work. We'll use an example. So here, what we've got an Australian dollar, and let's say it's worth 50 US cents, and then it depreciates. We've got market force depreciating, decrease in demand for the dollar. Whatever happens, people don't want our exports as much, so decreased demand. Great. So what happens is the central bank would just go in and they would take their US dollars that they have and they would buy Australian dollars. If they buy Australian dollars, the demand for Australian dollars increases and they can maintain that fixed value of the dollar at 50 cents, right? It is as simple as that. They just counteract the force. So that's one way of doing it. They buy their own currency. Let's say it goes the other way. For whatever reason, other countries buy more of our exports and our dollar appreciates, but we want a fixed currency, so we don't want that. So how do we do it? This is easy. They sell Australian dollars and they use those Australian dollars to buy foreign currency. So they will buy US dollars, for example. That increases the supply of Australian dollars, of course, and that would counteract that force and we would increase supply and we would keep the fixed value at 50 cents. Okay. Other actions they can take. We might not always have enough foreign currency reserves to buy our own currency. That's when it can run out. Obviously, we can always print more of our own currency to buy other currencies. That's easy. But our own currency, buying our own currency, we need foreign money to do that. So that can run out. So we need other options. What you could do is you could increase interest rates to lift demand for the currency, right? That has its problems, of course. So what side effects would this cause? Well, we're going to decrease our aggregate demand. We know this. We know this is essentially monetary policy, isn't it? It's going to decrease aggregate demand, less consumption, less investment. Another way that we could buy our own currency is we borrow money from overseas. So the central bank can borrow, let's say you borrow $1 billion US. Those US dollars have to get turned into Australian dollars. So that increases the demand for Australian dollars. So you can do that. That, however, can lead to debt. That debt has to be repaid. So if you borrow that money, you've got to pay interest on it, right? So we don't love doing that. Any policies to reduce imports will work. So you could do things like put in place tariffs, right? Ban the import of certain goods. You could do those things. If they reduce imports, then less money leaves the country. So there's less supply, the decrease in supply of the Australian dollar, and that will raise the value of the Australian dollar. But of course, then there are all the costs of trade protection. You don't want to do that. Other countries will retaliate, of course. You're going to start a trade war. You don't want to do that. That is bad policy. Now, changing the fixed value of a currency, we use slightly different terminology here. So we say it's a revaluation. That's the increase in value of one currency in terms of another as a result of government intervention. So if we say back before we had that $1 Australian dollar equaled 50 US cents, let's say we think that's too low. So we increase it to 60 cents. That would be called a revaluation. That's not called an appreciation. It's called a revaluation. And likewise, a devaluation is when we think, look, that 50 cents, it's too high. Maybe we're not selling enough exports. So we devalue our own currency with government intervention. That's not called a depreciation. It's called a devaluation. Why would we do this? We would do that. Generally, the biggest reason for this is when it becomes too hard to maintain that fixed exchange rate due to the market forces. You have to take too much action one way or the other. So if it becomes too hard, you generally have to go with the market forces to an extent, right? Because otherwise it's quite costly to maintain it. Now, there is something in between a floating exchange rate, which is purely demand and supply, and a fixed one, which is all government intervention, and that is a managed exchange rate. So it's mostly free floating, but the government gets involved from time to time to avoid large fluctuations. All right, those large fluctuations can hurt confidence in the currency, so they are often managed. That confidence we talked about before, it's going to lessen the disruption to trade and investment confidence. So we want that. Okay, so this might be the way we do it. So we might say, we're not going to maintain a fixed exchange rate, but we want it within a certain band. So rather than being exactly 50 cents, we might say, look, anywhere between 55 and 45 is okay. As long as everyone knows it's going to stay pretty stable, that's good for confidence and investment. So if a demand decreases, leads to a depreciation, that's fine. Not a big deal. If we get the appreciation from the increase in demand for the currency, that's fine. Also no big deal. So the intervention is only going to occur when we go outside of this acceptable band, right? And the interventions are just the same ones we saw earlier, exactly the same as that. Okay, we're going to look at what the consequences of some of this government intervention is. So we can have what is called an overvalued currency. So it's maintained higher through intervention than it would otherwise be. Right, so we say it's overvalued compared to what the market would say. Why would a country want to do that? They get cheap imports. You got a high value of the currency, imports become cheaper, and we can import capital goods and inputs. So capital goods like a tractor, inputs. It's often done by developing countries so that they can import the things they need to develop and diversify their industries. Right? That would be a valid reason to do it. It does come with costs, obviously. If you have cheap imports, you're going to have expensive exports. So it's going to hurt your industries that are trying to export, which is going to potentially hurt employment, right? You're buying imports instead of buying things locally as well. That could also affect employment. And an undervalued currency is the opposite. It's one that is lower than it otherwise should be. It's sort of artificially lower. Why would you do that? You want to sell more exports. So, for example, corn. You want to sell some more of your corn. You're going to undervalue your currency. You will sell more of it. Right? The obvious flip side to this is the more expensive imports. And you get more expensive imports, you're going to lead to cost push inflation, right? That's when the short run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. And it's also seen as cheating in trade by other countries. So in the past, countries have accused each other of artificially lowering their exchange rate in order to boost their exports and stimulate their economy. And their trading partners have said, look, wait, that's not fair. That's sort of trade protection. You're protecting your exporters like that. And that can lead to trade wars. Okay, and that is what we need to know for government intervention in foreign exchange. Excellent. See ya.